You know, wherever we look, we see a world in need of trust. For instance, since COVID, people have felt cautious about gathering together. Our kids have found it difficult to socialize in school again since going back. And there seems to be a fear out there of who can we trust? News media, government, healthcare providers? Who's telling the truth? Before we can trust, we really have to have a basis for it. So where do we go from here? How do we move forward? How do we find a new way to trust? We're looking for a force for good. Not just for ourselves, but we want to see a force for good out there in the world. And we want to be able to plant our feet solidly. We want something that we can reach out to 24/7, that we know is reliable, that we can turn to, that's rock solid. So today I'm going to share with you some promises that have been around for millennia. And my family's been relying on them for generations, and I'm going to share some of our stories with you. And those promises come from the Bible. The Bible hits the top of the bestseller list every single year in this country. And when I was in England a month ago, they told me that it was the most stolen book in the country. So I think that's quite interesting and a good thing. So we hear from people who read it for the first time that they find comfort in its pages when they need it. They read the stories and they find that those stories relate to their lives today. So we're going to look at some Bible promises through the lens of Christian Science, or the law of good. That force for good that we want to see in our lives. So before I go any further, I want to give a little bit of context for Christian Science. It all culminated, I should say, in the publication of this book in 1875, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy. Now, at that time, women weren't encouraged or expected to write on serious subjects. They wrote poetry, they wrote fiction, and they often incorporated their serious ideas into that. But for a woman to write a book about science, theology, and medicine was groundbreaking at the time. And as it began to be more distributed around the country, there was a stir in those ideas that came from this book. Now, Mary Baker Eddy grew up in New England, and she came from a typical farming family, busy household, and as was typical of the time, she was dependent on her male relatives for her support. As was customary, they gathered together every day, and her father would read from the Bible to the family and would preach to them about his theology. And for Mary Baker Eddy, this was a time of growth. She found it difficult to really feel settled with the idea of the God that she heard from her father. This vengeful God, a judgmental God, almost like a person watching us, checking on what we were doing. To her, there was a sense more of what was coming to her from when reading the Bible was a sense of love. And she saw that expressed in her mother's life, bringing the family together, the sense of unity in the family, the sense of caring and loving. There were often times when she had disputes with her father or the minister of the church, and she actually became ill from these discussions. And her mother would come to her and tell her to lean on God's love, to trust her faith in God. And when she did that, she found herself well again. Now, her neighbors, her family, her teachers at school saw something extraordinary in this young woman. She wasn't always well. She was searching for physical freedom for herself, but also a mental freedom, chafing against the restrictions of that time. And people began to see in her character something that portended of something greater. For instance, on the farm, her father used to bring her the sick animals because when she looked after them, they got well. Her brother had a serious accident on the farm with an axe. The doctor was called because he was bleeding profusely, but it was Mary that her father called, because by the time the doctor arrived, the bleeding had stopped and her brother was back to his work again. At school, she stood up to bullies. She didn't sit down to them. She just felt a power and authority in herself that she could speak to things that were not right. So there was something about her as she grew up where she was looking within the Bible herself for these promises that we're going to talk about today, to give herself that sense of freedom. You know, as she went through her young life and her middle age, she saw glimpses of healing from the Bible. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But as she began to see the results of her research and her thoughts on the Bible, this is how she began to articulate them in this book, Science and Health. I'm going to begin by telling a story about my own grandmother. She was 17 when she married, and it was an arranged marriage. By the time she was 19, she had 2 small children. And then she fell ill, and the doctor was called, and he said she had spinal meningitis. And as the days went by, she didn't get any better, and her mother was called to come and take care of her and to look after her little children. Well, the doctor didn't hold out any hope. He had tried everything he could, and he prepared my great-gran for the worst, that she would die. And I think you can imagine, my great-gran was just reaching out with everything she knew how. She did not want her daughter to die, and she didn't want her grandchildren to grow up without their mother. Well, she'd been given a copy of this book by a friend, and the friend had told her that for her, it had unlocked the Bible passages so that she began to understand the Bible. And she realized, too, that healing could take place today. So they'd begun to read the book together, but they hadn't got very far at that point. And one morning, my great-gran went into my gran and said, "Do you have faith that this can help us?" And my gran said, "Well, I know what Jesus said about faith. You only have to have this much, the grain of a mustard seed. And if you have that much, we can move mountains." But she said, "I don't feel I have that faith. I don't know where to get it." So my great-gran reached out to a Christian Science practitioner for help. She wanted to understand more about what this book offered. And she felt perhaps there she would get this assistance. Well, a Christian Science practitioner is someone that gives their time to answering calls from the public. Now, they could be calls about health, like it was in my grandmother's case, or it could be that maybe you've lost your job and you're needing to find a new sense of abundance of income for your family to put food on the table. Perhaps you're having a bad relationship with a colleague at work, or maybe with your spouse, and you just need new ideas to help you find a new way forward. Now, the practitioner isn't taking names of people and problems and then just asking God to intervene in these cases. What the practitioner is doing is lifting their thought up to understand more about what this divine presence is, to bring those ideas from their prayers, to bring them to those cases, and to help those individuals find a deeper understanding of what that divine presence is. So in my grandmother's case, she asked her to get her Bible and to read the 91st Psalm with an open mind. Well, when my gran first heard that, she thought, how can a song or a psalm heal me? I'm so sick. And then in the next breath, she thought, well, that's not being very open, is it? That's not being fair. I need to think to do what the practitioner's asking me to do. So she got her Bible and she thought, well, what does with an open mind mean? What does that mean? And she thought, well, I shouldn't be bringing my own ideas to this psalm, to this song. I need to come free of perhaps theological thoughts or concepts that I've picked up over time. I just need to listen. I need to listen to what the direction I feel is coming from this divine source. So she opened her Bible to that 91st Psalm, and this is our first Bible promise that we're going to talk about. I'm going to read a couple of verses from it. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In Him I will trust. Well, I think you can see that as my gran read those words, she felt that sense of protection, of safety, of a love that was around her at that particular point. And if you know that psalm yourself, you know it's full of problems that might assail us, might come into our lives to disrupt it. And that sense of this shadow of the Almighty is there to stop those ideas coming in and taking root. Well, my gran didn't just read those first couple of verses. She read all 16 of them. And by the time she'd finished, she knew something had changed in her. And she called to her mother, who was in another room. And that was remarkable because she hadn't spoken beyond a whisper for over a week. And her mother came in and they rejoiced together because she was well. She was able to get up. She was able to take care of her children straight away. This was an important turning point for my grandmother, to turn from looking at what society and her family told her was her role as she went forward in life, to really turning completely to that sense that she could turn to that divine presence for everything she needed. And she needed to do that. Her husband didn't survive very much longer past this experience, and she had to bring those boys up on her own. She had to find them education, she had to find employment for herself, and there were no social safety nets in those days to help her. She absolutely relied on that divine presence for everything she needed. And that really had an effect on my father's life and, of course, on mine as I grew up and began to see that I could trust this divine presence for everything I needed. And I think what that practitioner was bringing to the case as she was praying with my grandmother at that time was the sense that my grandmother could yield to that divine sense. I think often when we have a problem in our lives, we try to control it. We want to see the way out. We want to know what's coming at the end. And in this case, what my grandmother said she needed to learn was to just let go and let that divine presence flood into her consciousness. And that's what healed her at that moment. So let's talk about that divine presence and what it is. The Bible defines God as a spirit. Now, a spirit comes from, the word spirit comes from the Hebrew and Greek for wind or breath, something that's beyond our physical senses, beyond our sight, beyond our hearing. It's moving beyond what the boundaries of our physical world tell us. And we usually use those physical senses to give us evidence of what's going on around us. But I think we're all trying to push against those barriers, aren't we? You know, you only have to think about the Olympic Games and how they tell us that we can't possibly run any faster, we can't jump any higher. And yet every time we come together, we see those records broken, don't we? Where people are really pushing beyond those physical barriers. Now, this sense of spirit is more than that. It's telling us about the allness of this divine presence. Another word that the Bible uses for God is love. And we're not talking here about a human sense of love, because I know we all are aware of that. We all have our experiences of love, and we think we know what it is. But it's not that in and out, hot and cold, on and off kind of love. The love that if you like me, I'll like you. Or if you love me, maybe I'll love you. It's not something that needs to bring love out, because it is love itself. It's so big that it reaches beyond any human barriers. It has no edges. It has no other side to it. And when you understand a love that big, you understand that it's always present with us. It's always there. It's that sense of allness again that we want to think about. Now, Mary Baker Eddy in her book answers this question, what is God? And she says this: God is incorporeal, no body. And the Bible never defines God as a human form or a human person, either in this world or in another world. Divine, supreme, infinite mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, and love. Now, she didn't pick those words out of the air. This came from her deep research of the Bible, of looking at those Bible promises and seeing what the Bible was speaking about as God. We've talked about spirit and love as defined specifically in the Bible, but that sense of mind, for example, the Bible tells us about God's wisdom, that God doesn't need any counselors. His sense of intelligence is so big, that sense of hugeness that we were talking about with divine love. We could go through these and look within the Bible for where we could find their roots. And as you read Mary Baker Eddy's book, you see on every page that she is really deepening our understanding of what that divine presence is. Now, I wanted to share with you some Bible promises that speak to that love of God. And the first one I'm going to share with you is from the Hebrew Bible, from Deuteronomy. And it says this: "The beloved of the Lord shall dwell in safety by him, who shelters him all the day long, and he shall dwell between his shoulders." We're the beloved of the Lord, and we can dwell in safety by him. And if you think about this passage, and you think about the baby swans in the spring, they nestle on the back of their parent, in that soft, feathery shoulder of the parent. They're hidden from predators, and they glide there along the water on the back of their parent until they're ready to swim on their own. We can feel that same sense of embrace, that same sense of protection from our Father, from that divine parent, that Father, Mother, God. And then another one from the New Living Translation of the Bible, where it says this: "I will comfort you there in Jerusalem as a mother comforts her child." And I think we all love that image of the mother, the parent, caring unconditionally for the child. It just gives us an image of that embrace that we can feel again from that divine presence. You know, those Bible promises really show a God that isn't patterned after any human sense of what a divine presence should be. But we know it by that divine presence of love that we feel in our lives, the sense of intelligence we see around us. We can see that sense of truth, of honesty. We can begin to recognize it as coming from that divine presence. And when we see that, we know that that's something that's not going to change. It's something solid that we can look to, something that we can turn to when we need it. So when we begin to understand what that divine presence is, then we can begin to think about who we are in relationship to it and how we can begin to trust one another. You know, if we look at Jesus in the Gospels, he's always someone who seems to know who he is and what he's doing. He's constantly going back to that divine presence to know his sense of direction and where he's headed. That sense of being one with that divine presence. And if we think of that divine sense of love that we talked about, Jesus really expressed that in his ministry. For example, as he was going about his day, he was so inclusive in who he drew into listening to his teachings. It didn't matter to him whether you were young or old, whether you were a woman or a man, whether you were sick or healthy, or whether you were a social outcast or someone like a commander in the Roman Empire. It didn't matter to him who you were. You could listen to his teachings and be included in that sense of his love as he was speaking and preaching and healing to the crowds. And then as he was healing people, he didn't check up with their friends whether they were living a good life. He didn't triage the situation and heal the sickest people first and then go down the line and heal the less sick. He healed everyone. He embraced all that came to him for healing. You know, his teaching mission was beyond himself. He was showing us a new way forward so that we could know that sense of the divine better than we have ever done before. I mean, he was showing us what that allness, being one with that divine presence, really means. And that's just so important as we're thinking about looking for something to trust, because he expected us to follow in that pathway, not just to listen to it, but to actually practice it and move forward with it. And it confirms that anyone can feel that sense of harmony and protection in their life and that sense of love. He taught us that we can't ever be separated from that divine presence. And for that, I want to turn to a psalm, Psalm 139. And Jesus would have known these psalms. He would have learnt them in the synagogue. He would have been familiar with them. And it says here, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there." And then it mentions a couple of other locations that we might think God couldn't possibly be in, or we could perhaps run away from God. But no, it says that God is there, that ever-presence again, that allness of that divine presence. You know, we can always trust that God is always there for us. That even in the bleakest and the blackest moments, we can turn to it. Just as those people came to Jesus for healing, their lives weren't, always good. He was helping them understand that they could gain their freedom right at that moment. Now, through his healing work, he was also teaching us that we are all the children of God, and that we have access to that goodness of that divine presence. And not just access, but we are like that divine presence. So for that, I'm going to turn to Psalm 17. And right there it says this, "As for me, I will see your face in righteousness. I shall be satisfied when I awake in your likeness." So the psalmist there is expecting to awake in that likeness of the divine presence, in the spirit, in that love, in that truth, that sense of intelligence that we talked about. Now, wasn't it because Jesus was really looking beyond the physical needs of those that came to him, and he was seeing that likeness in those people that came to him? This was why he was able to meet their needs, because he wasn't holding them in that boundary of the physical that we talked about a little while ago, that sense where the mortal holds us in this sense of limitation. But he was looking up to see that sense of that reflection of what the divine is in each of those individuals that he was healing. And Mary Baker Eddy talks about this in her book very clearly. She says, "Jesus beheld in science the perfect man who appeared to him where sinning mortal man appears to mortals. In this perfect man, the Savior saw God's own likeness, and this correct view of man healed the sick." So, Jesus wasn't seeing a man who couldn't walk, a person that was immoral, or perhaps a man who was cheating his neighbors on their taxes. He was lifting his thought up to see that likeness of that divine parent in each of those individuals that he was healing. And maybe I can illustrate it one more way. Supposing we were down at the beach today, and perhaps it was a sunny day, so we could really see out there. And we look at the water in front of us, and it goes on forever, like that sense of love we talked about. We can just look at it, and it's going out there forever. That's kind of like that sense of the divine that we're talking about. But I could pick up a couple of drops of water in my hand. And we're kind of like those individual drops. And I can put them back in the ocean. We're not that whole, that sense of the divine ourselves. We're not God, but we are one with it. And that's what Jesus was explaining. That's what he was living, was that oneness with the whole. And those drops of water have the same characteristics as the ocean. So we have those same characteristics as that divine presence. We can begin to see that each of us can express that sense of love, can express that sense of honesty in our lives. Well, I want to give you an example of a healing I had that really helped me to understand this more clearly. Because, you know, the world tells us a very different story. It tells us that we're subject to our parents' hereditary beliefs that come from our parents, our DNA, that chance has a role to play in our lives, that at any moment we could have an injury or an accident and that could change everything. And we get this idea that we're going to eventually deteriorate. And all these things are assailing us and telling us that this is who we are. But we need to see that that is a very wobbly foundation. It's not something we can rely on or trust in any way. It's kind of like being on a seesaw. We want to feel that sense of trust, of who and what we are. So in this experience that I had, I was out one weekend with my husband, and we lived on a busy main road, and people dropped litter out of their cars, and the verge where we lived, it just grew very quickly. So we were out there in the summer, chopping away and carrying bundles of stuff around to the back to burn it all. Well, I'd forgotten about poison ivy. I'd had a little run-in with it, and it hadn't been very pleasant. Now, for some people, they don't have very much of a reaction to it. But for others, they have a very severe reaction to the oil that comes out when you chop a branch of poison ivy and that oil is exposed. And it seemed that night that that's what had happened to me. I just quickly, my body deteriorated. Within a day, I was very swollen. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I was very sensitive to noise and to light, and I needed help with taking care of myself. You know, as I've always turned to this divine presence for my health needs, it was a bit of a surprise to me because my prayers weren't really getting me anywhere. I wasn't seeing any physical improvement at this time. I seemed to be very stuck in this mortal sense of who I was, what the body was telling me, how in pain I was or irritated. That was all that I could kind of see at that point. So I called a Christian Science practitioner to help me. And immediately she began to talk to me about there not being two me's, that there wasn't this me that was suffering with all these problems, and the me that was the spiritual substance of that divine presence, that there couldn't be opposites in the same place. And she talked to me about not having clean water and dirty water in the same place. And it began to help break through that barrier that I was at that point, to begin to see that I had a choice to make here. Well, I asked some Christian Science nurses to take care of me too, because I knew that they would come to this in the same way that the practitioner was doing. They would see me in this same light, and it would help to relieve me of taking care of myself physically, and at the same time, they would be supporting me as I was lifting my thought up to a different place. Well, that weekend, I went to a friend's house. She was a Christian Science nurse. She'd offered to help me that weekend. And as I entered her home, I felt this enormous sense of love embracing me. Now, I knew my friend was a loving person, but I knew that this love had its source in that divine presence. And just as that quote on the wall there talks about divine love always has met and always will meet every human need, that's what I felt. I felt that this divine sense of love was right there with me, and that it was going to meet my every need at that moment. And yes, my friend cooked me nice meals. She sat with me and encouraged me to eat. She took care of my physical needs. And she sat with me when I was in pain and lifted my thought up and helped me to just let go of that physical sense of who I was. And I began again to feel a difference, a change happen. Well, the next day was Sunday, and she had to go to church to take care of some duties. And she said to me, you know, every service that our church has is a healing service. And I think if you went to that healing service, you will feel it will support you as you lift your thought up. Well, it was the last thing I wanted to do. My body was so swollen, I couldn't fit in my own clothes, and I certainly didn't want anyone to see me looking the way I was looking at that point. But she didn't push me. She just gently suggested it, and off she went. Well, I went into the next room, and she had laid out her own clothes so beautifully in order that I just found myself putting them on. And I went to church. And I have to say, the music, the words of the hymns, the readings that I heard, every single passage just supported that sense of who I was. I was that spiritual substance of love. How could that sense of who I was, that love, that energy, that intelligence, how could that be touched by an oil? I just began to see it so clearly that my thought lifted at that point. And as I left church, a friend offered to go for a walk with me in the sunshine, and I just went with her. I didn't even think about it. And when I got back to my friend's apartment, my husband rang and said, "When are you coming home? We miss you so much." And I said, "You can come now." I knew that at that moment, although my body hadn't changed, I was free. And he came and picked me up, and within a day, I was back at work and my body was completely back to normal. It was just a really important lesson for me to let go of that sense of limitation, to really see that there is only one expression of that divine presence. And you know, as we're looking at each other in that way, we all come from that same origin. We all have that same, we all express those same spiritual qualities. And that's why we can begin to trust one another. When we understand our origin, when we know that that's where we come from, that we have that honesty and integrity, that we have that love, that we have that intelligence. You know, that's what builds the trust, isn't it? And you really see this sense of needing to let go of this mortal sense of who we are. It comes through the Bible in so many ways. There's a thread as you read it. It begins in Genesis with that sense that God created us in his own image and likeness. In the Psalms, you'll read passages like I read to you about awakening in his likeness. And Jesus told us that we have to be reborn of spirit, to let go of the flesh, that it's the spirit that's important. And then in the Gospels, where Paul's writing, he talks about letting go of the old man and putting on the new man. This is what has helped me as I went through that experience to understand that there just are not two individuals here, that there's only one. You know, I think it all boils down to that great commandment that Jesus summarized, where he said that we need to love God first. That's that deepening of our understanding of what the divine presence is. And then we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. So first we have to know who we are, and then we can, in turn, love our neighbors. Well, many people feel there's just no way out. There's just such a mess out there. There's so many problems that are insurmountable. How can we get through this? You know, Jesus showed us that there is a saving power that is always with us. He was so confident as he was healing and teaching. He knew that way forward that he was showing us was that saving power that we needed to follow. You know, if we go back to his day, I think it helps us to understand this. Because remember, the Jews were occupied at the time by the Romans, and it was a very brutal regime. The Jews were longing for freedom, and they were searching the Hebrew Bible for the promises of this saving power that it told them was coming. They were looking for that savior, for that sense of being led out of this problem. I think they hoped it would be a leader like Moses, who led the children of Israel out of Egypt, out of slavery, and led them to the promised land. They were hoping for that sense of freedom at last. But they were beginning to recognize within Jesus' healing works and the way he was speaking to them, that sense of love that he talked about was revolutionary. And they were hearing this, and they were feeling, well, is this the Messiah that we've been waiting for? They were beginning to identify him in that way. They called him the Christ, and the Christ was a title of the anointed, the Savior. He was showing them that they had their freedom right there and then. And these are the Bible promises that I'm going to relate to you now from the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, where Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and the kingdom of God is within us. It's not something that's going to come in 5 years or in 100 years or in another experience. It's right now. He was telling those people, you can find your freedom right now at this moment. And this is what Mary Baker Eddy was looking for as she was searching the Bible herself for freedom. She was looking for that promise of the nowness of healing for herself. And as she went through the years, she began to glimpse that as she understood what was going on in those Bible stories, she saw healing in her own life and she saw it in people around her. Now, at one point, she had an accident which her friends believed was going to be fatal. They gathered in a room waiting for her to die. She was in another room with her Bible. And this shows her character that we talked about at the beginning, this persistence of turning to the Bible when she had a need. She read one of the gospel stories of Jesus' healings, and she knew at that moment that this was where the answer was to what she was searching for. And in that moment, she felt a change in her body. She was able to get up and join her friends in the other room, to their surprise. And it was at that point she began a really deep 3-year research into the Bible. And she began to articulate her ideas. She began to heal other people. She began to teach people how to heal so they could heal too. One instance was she was called to the bedside of a woman who was dying. The doctor had said he could do no more. He was still present, and she healed the woman in minutes. And the doctor said to her, how did you do that? Have you written down your ideas, your method? And she said no, she hadn't. And he said, well, you need to write a book so that others can see how you did this. So this is why she was really beginning to articulate the ideas and be able to write them down in this book, Science and Health. She knew that there was a system of healing there, a law, that law of good we talked about in the beginning that was provable. This is why it eventually became known as Christian Science. That sense of following Christ Jesus' healings and teachings, and also that sense of science, that body of knowledge that's provable by anyone. Now, Mrs. Eddy went on, as Kim said, to establish the first Church of Christ Scientist in Boston. And this church here in Arcadia and the one in Glendora are branches of that first Church of Christ Scientist. And she also set up a publishing company to publish her books, but also she set up a weekly and a monthly magazine. And in those, people asked questions about this science, how it could be used. There were testimonies of healing, how people were using this science. So if you're someone that's not familiar with Christian Science, I really encourage you to take a copy of her book today, and the Bible if you need a copy of the Bible. But take a copy of her book and really dig into it. I would suggest you read the final chapter, which is called Fruitage. They're letters from people who didn't know anything about Christian Science. They knew something about the Bible, probably, but they had all sorts of individual problems in their lives, and just reading this book healed them of those problems, and they explain it in the letters at the back of the book. And then take copies of those weekly and monthly magazines, because they show you how people today are using that science and using it to heal themselves and their families of many different kinds of problems. You know, I think Christ Jesus was really showing us that new way, and we need to listen and follow in that new direction. He was showing us how we could find this freedom right now. And Christian Science really unlocks those Bible teachings to us, and it shows us that we can use this not just once, but all the time. We can weave it into our daily lives and begin to turn to that divine presence for trusting it for healing of any kind. So these promises are for everyone. They're universally available. But then why do we still see bad things happen? Why do we see so many struggling to make ends meet? Why are there so many innocents that are affected by gun violence in our society? I could list a whole lot of things. You would nod and agree. But we see these things happening in front of us. So do we just close our eyes and pretend it's not happening? Do we turn off the TV or not read the newspapers anymore? No. We need to face it squarely. We need to face those problems squarely. And the way to do this is to get in touch with this divine presence ourselves, to feel this sense of love. And when you do that, you know that God doesn't play favorites. That love is like the sun on a sunny day. We all feel its warmth. Not just a few people over here and these over there don't feel it. Everyone feels it. So this love is available to every single one, but we have to acknowledge that and really know it. Secondly, we have to trust God, trust that divine presence. We get so engrossed in the problem, like I did in my healing. I was so in this zone that we have to lift our thought above that to turn to that divine presence for the answers. You know, Jesus' disciples didn't heal someone once and begged Jesus to tell them, well, why didn't we heal this person? After all, they were learning from the master healer. And he said, it's about faith. It's about a lack of faith. And remember, my grandmother knew that you only had to have this much, a grain of mustard seed, and then we can go forward. So we need to really get that sturdy trust of good before we can help those problems in our world that are in front of our eyes. And then we need to hold to that true model. We need to keep our thought uplifted and inspired. And what helps me to think of this is, you know, in the old days when there was an eclipse of the sun, people thought the world was coming to an end. Now we know better today. We know that we only have to wait and the sun will come out. So let's hold to that true sense of what we know is that force for good, that law of good in action, and hold to that, even when we see the things that seem to assail our communities and our societies. You know, evil does appear to be an entity in and of itself. But just like darkness, if you just take a sliver of light to that darkness, you know that the darkness begins to disappear. You begin to realize that darkness isn't an entity in itself. It's the light that's the truth, the light that is really displacing that darkness. So every time we have a good thought that displaces a bad one, we're bringing that sense of light to our communities and to those problems. And you remember that passage I read in Psalm 139, the one where it says that God is always with us. A little bit later it says this, if I say, surely the darkness shall fall on me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. So we really can begin to see that darkness will disappear as we bring the light to these problems. You know, everything we've talked about today points to the fact that our thought is the place where these changes happen. How do we find this hope? How do we deepen our understanding of it, of these concepts? Well, one passage from Mrs. Eddy's book helps me a lot. It says this: love inspires, illumines, designates, and leads the way. So it's not us that have to think up the ideas. It's that sense of divine love that's going to inspire us. It's going to bring the ideas to us. It's going to light them up, illumine them for us, designate them, mark out the way for us. And then it's not leaving us, it's leading the way. That love is leading us. So we're never alone when we face these problems. I think disciplining, improving our thought, living that standard that Jesus taught us by exercising our spiritual substance, bringing that purity and goodness and truth into our lives, that's going to help us to see the light in our own lives. And then getting to know those Bible promises better. I've just read about 6 or 7 to you, but you can explore the Bible and you'll find thousands of those promises there that can inspire you and lift you up. And then use Mary Baker Eddy's book to open up the Bible for you. And another thing that Jesus said to his disciples was that prayer was very important. He said we need to go into the closet and shut the door. Well, we can hear our phones pinging, can't we, every few minutes, and that TV sometimes is blaring away in the house. So sometimes we just need to have that moment of time when we're just searching for that direction, listening. Like my grandmother had to listen with an open mind. Let those distractions go and really listen for the direction that we need to go in. Well, my last example is of a friend of mine who came to live in Massachusetts. She came from another state because it had very high unemployment. And she felt coming to Massachusetts, she'd be able to find a job that could help her family. But it wasn't how it turned out. She couldn't find anywhere to live because it was just so expensive. And then she had an accident and ended up in a wheelchair. So there she was, living in a basement with her husband and 3 little children, little boys under the age of 6. And she was in a wheelchair trying to look after them. So I think you can imagine things were not the way she wanted them to be. And she was on the phone with a friend telling her how bad things were and trying to figure out what she should do next when her friend said, well, I've had some difficulties in my life, but a friend gave me this book. And I read it, and it helped me to find the answers that I needed. So she said, why don't you find a church, buy the book, and see how it can help you? And so she landed at our church one Sunday with her 3 little boys. Now, she was back on her feet by then. Well, we wrapped our arms around her family, and there were lots of practical things we did to help her at that moment. But as we got to know her, these weren't the things that were really going to move her life in a different direction. First of all, she felt that society had placed her in a poverty trap, that however many jobs she and her husband got, they wouldn't be able to climb out of the debt or find a home to live in. The second thing was she felt her relationships were very vulnerable. She didn't always feel safe. And the third thing was, as a young mum of 3 kids, she didn't think she had any more to give. She was already working as hard as she could, And she also didn't feel she had any more intelligence to bring to the situation. So that's what we did. We really opened up. She knew the Bible. She'd been brought up by a grandmother who had introduced her to the Bible. But we introduced her to science and health and began to help her understand that she could literally turn from relying on people, relying on institutions and organizations to help her, to this divine presence. And that this divine presence would show her step by step what she needed to do to help her family at this point. And that's what happened. She really did move forward in her life, finding the employment she wanted at that particular time that helped her family. And a few years after this, she wrote me a letter, and she said I could share some of her thoughts with you today. She said that God had supplied her with everything she needed to get through the toughest time. And she said it was so different from the times where she'd physically suffered hardship completely alone. And then she said, I can accept the good, all the massive amounts of good that have come into my consciousness, and allow myself to accept that I am loved, that God is loving me, and that if all these good things have come from him, I can accept them. And as I was thinking this, it came into my head, I don't have to suffer. I don't have to let these views that take away the goodness that God has given me rule. I can just accept God's goodness, in which there is no suffering. And just a couple of weeks ago, she graduated from university, summa cum laude, top of her class. And she's going into a master's program, and she's beginning to look for employment. I mean, she's had good employment, but now she's looking in a specific area that she's interested in, that she's always wanted to work in since high school. So her life is moving forward by trusting in that divine source. Now, as we turn to this divine love, this wonderful presence that we've talked about for our every need, it maintains us and it sustains us. It blesses us. It keeps us safe. You know, Jesus said, we're not just that sliver of light. We are the light of the world. So we can bring that light into our lives, our own lives first, but then we can let it radiate out into our communities and into the world around us. The power of our lives on our surroundings, we can't underestimate it. That good multiplies when we see that that good is the only power there is. It's the only activity there is, and we bring that light to our families, to our neighborhoods, to our communities, wherever we happen to be. So we've learned today a little bit more about what that divine presence is and who we are in relationship to it. And then we can see how we can change our view about what's going on around us. So just as my grandmother's life was changed completely, how my friend's life moved in a totally different direction, how it shaped my life and continues to shape it, you too can find trust even as the world changes around you. So thank you so much for coming today. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So just come up afterwards. But thank you so much for being here.